Right before we get going on the notes, you should probably pause the video and jot down these test breakdown by topic and number of questions, total of 45 questions. Alright, so as we get started, just kind of general functions that you probably covered pretty easily in your study guide. I've given you a slightly different picture on your notes. I'm not going to give you this picture on the test or expect you to know anything about this picture on the test. It just kind of gives you, just since we're talking about the overall function of these urinary system, here is basically the overall structure of it. So functions you should know. Don't worry about overall structure. The only structures you'll have to know are the nephron, picture that you've seen 800 times and picture you'll see again in the notes. So here's the path of urine, again something that you'll have to know through the kidney, which is obviously the nephron collecting duct that we've talked about, and then out that collecting duct through ureter, bladder, urethra, and out the body. Here's a lateral and sagittal section of the kidney. You can see minor and major calyces and cortex and stuff. That, by the way, I will not ask you about cortex and medulla on the test. Some other structure things, the renal artery and renal vein, which you can see are here on either side, being supplied and dumping into the largest artery and vein in our body, the abdominal aorta and inferior vena cava. So pretty significant structures, and you can see the immediate branching from those two structures, and which would sort of infer their importance, the kidney's importance in the blood supply through here and the filtering that we talk about in kidney. So again, renal artery and renal vein, just talking about direction to and from the heart. Here's another picture that maybe gives you a little more detail than you'll be expected to know. I'm not going to ask you about all the different arteries and veins within the kidney, but just another picture, and there's a couple other pictures in here that you'll see that are not in your notes. But if you chose to go to the PowerPoint and print these things off or copy and paste them onto a Word document, that might be helpful for studying. Like this picture, here's one of those renal pyramids that you can see both cortex and medulla, where the nephron is located, collecting duct, and then leading out from it, dumping out into the minor calyx, which then dump into the major, which would go to the ureter and off to the bladder. So again, just another picture just to give you an idea of exactly what we're talking about on this unit. Kidney structure, obviously the nephron is the most important part. We'll get into the details of that, and have gotten into details of that. Afferent and efferent arterioles, which are leading into and out of the glomerulus, which are the capillaries that is housing basically the filtration zone of the nephron. Blood supply, obviously we're talking about the peritubular capillary, the blood supply that's intertwined with the proximal tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal tubule, and the gas exchange that takes place there. The beginning of the nephron is, of course, the Bowman's capsule, which includes the glomerulus, which is the cluster of capillaries inside here, shown in purple, where the filtration is going to take place. And then eventually lead that filtrate out the proximal tubule down to the through the nephron. Which there's just another picture of it. You have this picture sideways in your notes just to make it a little bit bigger. And then the next page in your notes is actually just another coloring slide. So you can color it if you're interested and if you think you'll need it. The page after that you have is another labeling picture. This is very similar to what you'll see in the test. Not this one. Pick the next slide in your notes. That is after the coloring one. With the blanks that you should be labeling, so that's a good way to practice for the test. And again, just to see what that nephron is located, glomerulus, nephron, and collecting duct, all located within the kidney itself. We're talking about approximately 1 million nephrons per kidney, so quite a lot of filtering going on. And again, the parts of the nephron that you just need to know in order and where they are located. Here's that picture I was referring to. That was the next slide in your notes. That you should be able to label all these parts, A through whatever's up here, J. Here's another picture that would be good in case you were copying and pasting onto a Word document or printing off a PowerPoint or just going back to the PowerPoint for another resource. This is a really good picture of most important parts of this unit, focusing on the nephron. So the 3 stages in your information are here. Pressure filtration, which is the blood filtration, which is taking place at the glomerulus, of course, which is specially designed, structurally designed for filtration. It's leaky. It has these podocytes, which are cells that basically have little extensions that can close the gap or open up gaps for filtration through the capillaries. Something else that you should recognize is part of the glomerulus is talking about filtration and pressure. Talked about it quite a bit, and you've seen it in the handwritten notes video, the notes packet that you have. And so it should be something that should make sense, and if it doesn't, it's something that you need to reference either your book, notes, or notes packet to make sense out of it. It's pretty simple. The capillaries here are under extremely high pressure, and that's going to force things to move out of them into the capsule and beginning of the filtration process, and where the filtrate is being made. And that's the water, glucose, bicarbonate, salt, and things that are coming out of the blood. Things that should not be coming out of the blood are the blood itself and the proteins that are in the blood. Here's another picture of glomerulus, so it gives you a really good idea. Some red blood cells inside there, afferent and efferent arterioles, the yellowish-orange podocytes, again, increasing or decreasing the filtration rate. And then here's this, just the filtrate, just this stuff that empties out into the capsule and makes its way down the proximal tubule through the nephron. 2 pressures that you want to remember, hydrostatic and osmotic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is just the pressure on the container, whether that is the capsule, Bowman's capsule, or a vessel itself. Osmotic pressure is basically the water pressure, and this is caused by the solutes, but also the proteins that are in the blood. Take a look at that. You may want to take a second to make sure you know which arrow is pointing where in your notes, since they are black and white. Here are the green arrows, which is the capsular hydrostatic pressure. Also moving back in is the blood osmotic pressure, or just osmotic pressure. And coming out is the glomerular or blood hydrostatic pressure. So again, hydrostatic meaning the pressure on the capillaries, which you can see are really small tubes. And the smaller they are, the more pressure there is up against them, where the pressure leading out of this structure, the glomerulus, the capsule, is going to be about 10 millimeters of mercury, which is just enough pressure to basically make this nephron function the way it does. So make sure that this color picture can relate to the black and white picture that you have in your notes. Here's the overall math. The total out, which is the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, minus the pressure that is being pushed back on the glomerulus. These 2 guys here, the osmotic pressure and the hydrostatic, the capsular hydrostatic pressures, are going to create that overall pressure out of the glomerulus to the nephron. I'm going to refer you to the control of the glomerular filtration rate, GFR, animation at on Haiku, which is, again, the handwritten notes series, which does a pretty good job talking about filtration rates of these guys. I'm talking about the filtration rates of the stuff inside here. And he goes into a lot more detail with some drugs and stuff that you can kind of ignore that part. We're not going to get into those details. Again, the filtration rate is talking about filtration of the blood at the glomerulus. Changing the diameter is going to change the rate. Changing the amount of proteins in the blood will change the rate, because those proteins are basically regulating the blood pressure or osmotic pressure, which is essentially the same thing. And then again, changes, the last would be changes in the pressure of the capsule. So increasing the pressure in the capsule out here is going to be more pressure on the blood back in, so that would decrease the overall pressure. The net filtration pressure, or net pressure, or net outward pressure, however people call it, net filtration pressure. So some things that, you can imagine these being test questions. Problems with high blood pressure or dehydration, how that affects pressure and rate. GFR is just standing for glomerular filtration rate, which there's again that video that I'm going to refer to that I put on Haiku for you. How the podocytes are working to block the holes and allowing more or less fluid to come out of the capillary. Here's a syndrome, hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is basically the destruction of red blood cells, which reduces the blood volume, which is reducing the blood pressure, which is reducing the filtration rate. If you think about the pressure that would be built up in these capillaries, the less stuff that is here, the less pressure pushing up against the wall of those vessels. And that's the deal with this syndrome, which is going to lead to renal failure. There's some symptoms and things associated with that. The next part of your information is tubular reabsorption. And again, that's talking about reabsorption back into the blood. Most of this stuff is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream, almost all of it. There are wastes and things that are not, that are coming from the blood. Those will be secreted. Your diagram looks a little bit different. All you have to do is just draw some arrows to get the idea of where things are going. Sodium is getting pumped in by active transport. Sodium is going in to the proximal convoluted tubule, which is right here. Remember, the proximal convoluted tubule is where most of the reabsorption and secretion is taking place. And so here's where most of the reabsorption takes place of sodium. So arrow in. Same with chlorine, phosphates, and bicarbonate. These are all arrows in. Bicarbonate, I believe, is already in yours, so you can just draw an arrow from the outside to the bicarbonate just to show that these things are all passing through. These guys are passing through by just diffusion, passive transport. Sodium is passing through by active transport. Water is also coming in, and we've seen that enough, I think, by now. But simply water is following the solutes. It's just diffusion. So water is going towards the area of lesser concentration of water. So these things that are moving in. Sorry, this is the bloodstream down here. Distal. Sorry. Proximal convoluted tubule is outside. Reabsorbed is the bloodstream here. Paratubular capillary. Sorry. So the tube in your picture is the capillary. Reabsorption back into the bloodstream. Shows that this is easy to confuse. Here are some other numbers that, this is again talking about the loop of Henle, which is basically in charge of concentrating the blood, concentrating the urine, and very simply taking the water out. How much water comes out is going to cause it to be more or less concentrated. Something here that I'm really not going to worry too much about is the capillaries that are surrounding the loop, the vasorecta, moving in the opposite direction of the loop. The blood flows the opposite direction, not really a big deal, but again, this has to do with the reabsorption of water and salt, allowing for the concentration or dilution of urine, which takes place here at the loop of Henle. And I'm going to stop there just for the sake of making this approximately a 15-minute video, and wonder if you noticed the sign that these little girls have in front of there. little lemonade shop, if you want to call it that.